The Deep Space Research Vessel Event Horizon hangs motionless at the very edge of known space. Its crew listens to a ghostly, repeating signal that whispers coordinates into an uncharted void. Captain Eva Rostova grips her command chair, her voice steady but grim as she makes a chilling declaration. "That is not a star pattern," she says. "It is a map, and it is calling us." With that, she sets a course into the terrifying unknown. By the end of this story, you will understand the true horror that waits for humanity in the dark, a warning from the abyss itself. What ancient intelligence sent that signal, and what terrible price does it demand from those who answer? What would you risk to satisfy a curiosity that could end everything? The signal was a needle of pure data, stitching through the void. On the main viewer, its waveform resolved not into chaotic noise, but into a complex, layered structure, a mathematical poem repeating on a loop. Science Officer Lynn's hands flew across her console, her voice a mixture of awe and dread. "This is not a natural phenomenon," she stated. "It is a language, a structured message of immense complexity. The intelligence behind it is ancient, far older than any known civilization. Its age alone is terrifying." As she spoke, the ship's long-range sensors flickered to life, painting a new image on the star chart. Against the deep black, massive planetary bodies began to resolve. They were not reflecting any starlight. They were simply voids, darker than the space around them, perfect spheres of absolute nothingness. And they were moving. Their collective gravitational pull was immense, a silent, irresistible tide already gripping the event horizon. The ship was no longer following a course we set. We were being pulled, drawn into the heart of an impossible destination. What kind of world does not shine but instead devours light? What ancient hand built these dark anchors in the sea of stars, and why are they calling us now? The warp engines wind down into an unnerving silence. Outside the main viewport, the familiar star-dusted tapestry of the galaxy was simply gone, replaced by a perfect, unbroken obsidian. It was a hole punched through reality, a starless void where light itself seemed to die. Captain Rostova stood frozen at her station, her knuckles white as she gripped the console. Her voice was a haunted whisper, barely audible over the ship's ambient hum. "There are no stars here," she said, "only shadows," and then we saw them. Colossal spheres of absolute blackness drifted in the infinite dark, their silhouettes visible only as they blotted out the faint, distant glow of the galactic rim behind them. These were the shadow planets. They did not reflect a single photon. They absorbed everything, radiating a profound, unnatural cold that our sensors registered as a physical force. It was a chill that began to seep through the event horizon's reinforced hull, a deep space frost that settled into our bones. The very air inside the ship felt heavier, thinner, as if the warmth of existence was being slowly drawn out into that lightless expanse. We had arrived at the source of the signal, only to find a cemetery for suns. What kind of gravity could hold light itself prisoner? Alarms screamed through the bridge, a shrill counterpoint to the low groan of the ship's superstructure. The deck plates shuddered under our feet, a violent tremor that built with terrifying speed. Helmsman Cale wrestled with his console, his face a mask of sweat and strain. "The helm is not responding," he shouted, his voice cracking with the effort. "We are being pulled in." It was not a gradual drift. It was a lurch, as if some colossal, unseen hand had closed its fist around the event horizon and was dragging us down. Our main engines flared at maximum burn, a desperate act of defiance, but they were useless against this force. This was not the clean, predictable pull of a star or a black hole. This was something else, a gravity that felt intelligent, deliberate. It did not just bend space, it seemed to rewrite the local laws of physics. Our systems began to fail in cascading waves. Screens flickered with static. Navigation arrays spun wildly, unable to lock onto any fixed point in a reality that was no longer stable. The very light inside the ship dimmed and wavered, as if the shadow planet ahead was drinking the energy from our power cores. We were not just being pulled toward a world. We were being consumed by a principle of nature we did not understand, a force that treated our technology like a child's toy. What do you do when the universe itself turns against you? When the rules you have built your existence upon simply cease to apply? The event horizon slid into the upper atmosphere, but there was no roar of friction, no scream of tortured metal. The ship met the boundary of the shadow world in utter silence. It was not cutting through air, but a thick, viscous medium that clung to the hull like tar. Every sound from outside was instantly smothered, creating a vacuum of noise that was somehow louder than any explosion. On the bridge, Communications Officer Jax slammed his palm against his console, his voice tight with panic. "All external comms are dead," he reported. "It is not just a signal loss, it is a complete void. It is like we have been swallowed." As he spoke, a new horror unfolded. One by one, the powerful external lights along the ship's hull began to wink out. It was not a power failure. It was as if the darkness outside was a living thing, a sentient ink that actively sought out and consumed each source of illumination. First, the forward landing beacons vanished. Then the starboard running lights were extinguished. Port side followed. The main observation windows, which moments before had shown the oppressive black of the planet, now showed nothing at all. A perfect, absolute darkness pressed in on all sides, a physical presence that felt heavier than any ocean. The only light left was the dim, emergency glow of the bridge consoles, a tiny bubble of reality in an infinite sea of nothing. We were no longer flying. We were sinking, descending into a grave that had been waiting for us since the first whisper of that ghostly signal. What happens when the light is gone, and the only thing left to hear is the frantic beating of your own heart? The emergency thrusters fired in a series of violent, jarring bursts, fighting against the unnatural pull. We did not land so much as fall with a purpose, the ship groaning in protest as it met the unyielding surface. The impact was a deafening crunch of metal and a shower of sparks across the bridge. For a moment, there was only the hiss of ruptured conduits and the stunned silence of the crew. Then, the main viewer flickered back to life, offering our first look at the world that had captured us. It was a landscape of jagged, obsidian-like spires that clawed at a sky of absolute black. The structures seemed to writhe at the edges of our vision, a subtle, fluid motion that made the eyes water. It was not a trick of the light, for there was no light to trick us. It was the ground itself, alive and shifting. Engineer Sato's voice cut through the dazed quiet, his report delivered from a maintenance crawlspace with grim finality. "Hull integrity is critical, Captain. The outer plating is not just damaged, it is dissolving. This environment is actively consuming us. The readings show a molecular breakdown at an impossible rate." "It is not corrosion, it is assimilation." His words hung in the cold air, a death sentence for our ship and a stark warning for us. We were not standing on a planet. We were standing inside a digestive system. The order was given, our voices thin with a fear we could no longer contain. We scrambled for the hazardous environment suits, our only hope for a few more hours of life. The act of sealing the helmet felt less like safety and more like closing a coffin lid. What do you do when the very ground beneath your feet is hungry? The airlock door slid open onto a silence so profound it felt like a physical blow. Our helmet lights carved weak, trembling cones into the absolute dark, illuminating a plane of that same shifting, jagged ground. Every footstep was muffled, as if the ground drank the sound of our movement. It was Kale who spotted them first, his light catching on a series of tall, slender shapes rising from the obsidian floor. They were monoliths standing in a loose, irregular circle, their surfaces unnaturally smooth. As we approached, A new sensation began to prick at the edges of our awareness. It was not a sound, but a low, psychic hum that vibrated deep inside our skulls, a pressure against the mind itself. Science Officer Lin moved forward as if in a trance, her gloved hand reaching out toward the nearest stone. "Do not touch it," the captain warned, her voice tight over the suit comms, but it was too late. Lin's fingers made contact with the dark surface. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. She recoiled with a sharp cry, stumbling back as if electrocuted. Her breath came in ragged gasps that echoed in our helmets. Fragmented thoughts, alien and horrifying, flooded her mind. She saw cities of crystalline light, civilizations that spanned star systems, a history of peace and immense knowledge. And then she saw the end, a wave of devouring shadow that consumed light, life, and time itself, a sorrow so vast it could drown galaxies. She gripped her helmet, her voice a choked whisper that carried the weight of eons. "They are not stones, they are memories, trapped here for eons. Each one is a tombstone for a world that was erased. This planet is not a place. It is a museum of extinction, and we are the newest exhibit. What unbearable truth is locked inside a stone that has witnessed the death of suns?" Valeria's shout tore through the stunned silence. A figure, woven from the very darkness around us, drifted into the edge of our light. It had no solid form, only a shifting silhouette that bled into the air like smoke. It glided straight through a jagged obsidian spire as if the stone were mist, leaving a trail of glittering frost in its wake. Security Chief Valeria didn't hesitate. Her energy pistol hummed and a brilliant lance of plasma tore through the entity's center. The shot passed through it completely, splashing harmlessly against a monolith behind it and leaving no mark. The thing stopped. It turned slowly, a void where a face should have been. Then its form shivered and coalesced, the shadows pulling together to form the familiar, weathered features of a man in an antique exploration suit. His name patched clear for all to see. He was from the Odyssey, a ship lost over a century ago. The face opened its mouth, and a chorus of 1,000 broken whispers, a symphony of lost souls, spoke a single sentence. "You should not have come." Then it dissolved, vanishing into the oppressive dark from which it came. The thing was gone, but its presence lingered like a scar on reality. A cold, psychic residue washed over us, a wave of pure anguish that bypassed our ears and poured directly into our minds. We saw them, the crews of other ships, explorers from forgotten eras. We saw them clawing at their own faces as the darkness seeped into their minds, their sanity unraveling like old rope. We saw others simply stop, their bodies dissolving into the shifting ground, their final screams of terror not fading but being absorbed, added to the planet's dreadful chorus. Jax fell to his knees, his whole body trembling as the visions receded. His voice was a raw, broken thing over the comms. "They are all still here," he gasped. "Their minds, their memories, their pain. It is all trapped, woven into the fabric of this place. This planet is not a museum. It is a prison, and we have just been processed as the newest inmates." Before the horror of his words could fully settle, the ground itself answered. The jagged, obsidian plain began to move with a low, grinding rumble we felt through our boots. Spires retracted into the floor like sinking claws, while other ridges erupted to form new, impassable walls. A clear pathway began to form ahead of us, a canyon of shifting black rock that curved deliberately toward the horizon. Captain Rostova watched the living geography reshape itself, her voice grim with realization. "It is hurting us," she said, her gaze fixed on the newly formed route. "This entire world is a single, sentient entity, and we are being led directly to its heart. There was no other path, no way to retreat. The terrain behind us was already sealing shut, a closing trap. With no other choice, our tiny circle of light began to move forward, walking the road a planet had built for us, toward a destination we could not possibly comprehend." What does a living world want with the ghosts it collects? And what awaits at the center of a conscious abyss? The path carved by the shifting ground ended at the mouth of a cavern, so vast it felt less like an opening, and more like the sky had been torn away. It plunged straight down into an even deeper darkness, a maw that breathed out an arctic wind. The psychic pressure we had felt near the monoliths was a gentle hum compared to the scream that emanated from this pit. It was a silent, crushing weight on the soul, a chorus of lost voices so dense it felt solid. Kale stared at the cavern's edge, his helmet light tracing the smooth, flowing contours of the rock. It lacked the sharp, fractured lines of natural geology. His voice was a low, horrified mutter over the comms. This was not built, it was grown, he was right. The walls looked organic, like the petrified roots of some world-sized tree, or the fossilized veins of a dead god. Captain Restova stood at the precipice, her figure silhouetted against the nothingness. "We are going down," she stated, her tone leaving no room for debate. "This is the source. This is where the signal was born." The finality in her voice was unmistakable. We all knew this was a one-way trip. There would be no triumphant return, no glorious report to command. We were walking into the belly of the beast to learn its nature, even if that knowledge was our epitaph. We checked our suit seals one last time, the ritual a pathetic defense against the existential chill that waited below. Our lights, already feeble, seemed to shrink back from the entrance as we activated our descent rigs, rappelling into the planet's core. Each meter down felt like sinking into a frozen ocean of pure sorrow. What waits at the center of a conscious abyss, and what terrible truth is so vital it must be witnessed, even if the witness is never meant to leave? Our descent ended on a wide, organic shelf overlooking a cavern of impossible scale. At its center hung a pulsating, veined sphere the size of a small moon, radiating a sickly, rhythmic violet light that cast long, dancing shadows. It throbbed like a dying heart, and the psychic scream we had felt from above was its breath. Science Officer Lynn activated her scanner, the device whirring frantically before she silenced it, her face pale in the ghastly glow. Her voice was a hollow echo in our helmets. "It is a brain, a planetary-scale consciousness, and it is dying." She looked from the pulsating core to the monoliths far above, her horror dawning into a terrible understanding. These shadow planets are not natural phenomena. They are the final refuge of a civilization that transcended physical form, uploading their collective minds into these artificial worlds to achieve immortality. They succeeded, but at a cost we can barely comprehend. They became trapped, their consciousness fused with the very structures meant to house them for eternity. This planet and all the others like it are their tombs. Captain Restova stepped forward, her gaze locked on the colossal brain. As if in response, a tendril of that faint violet light detached itself from the core and snaked through the air, touching her helmet. She did not flinch. Her body went rigid, her eyes wide, seeing something far beyond the cavern. A flood of images, of concepts, poured directly into her mind. She saw their golden age, a society of pure energy and light. Their decision to shed their fragile bodies and live forever as thought and memory. But she also saw the flaw in their grand design, the terrible hunger that followed transcendence. Their new forms required a constant influx of external consciousness, of lived experience, to sustain themselves. Without it, they would slowly fade into nothing, their immortal minds unraveling into static. Rostova staggered back, the violet light releasing her. Her voice was thick with a pity that bordered on terror. "They are not malevolent," she whispered, the words chilling us more than any threat. "They are starving. For eons they have used that signal to lure ships, to draw in new minds. They do not consume our bodies. They absorb our memories, our experiences, our very souls, adding our brief, vibrant lives to their own fading eternity to stave off the end. We are not prisoners, we are food. As if her realization were a dinner bell, the entire cavern convulsed. The ground beneath our feet heaved, and the organic walls began to contract. Engineer Sato's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and urgent. "Captain, I have an idea, but it is a one-way trip. We can overload the ship's core reactor. The resulting pulse will be pure, chaotic energy. It should act like a psychic shockwave, disrupt their hold on this local reality just long enough for us to break away. The blast will cripple the event horizon, probably for good, but it is our only chance. We have to get back to the ship now." The tremors intensified, the pathway behind us already crumbling into the abyss. The starving mind of the planet was closing its jaws. Our flight back to the surface became a nightmare ascent. The very air thickened around us, and from the shifting walls, the shadow entities boiled forth in a swarm. This time, they did not mimic long-lost explorers. They wore the faces of our own ghosts. A figure stepped from the dark, its form resolving into Valeria's first commanding officer, the man who had died saving her life on a Martian outpost. His voice was a perfect, heartbreaking echo of memory. "You do not have to leave, Valeria. The pain ends here. You can rest with us." For a moment, her weapon wavered, her stance breaking. Then, with a raw shout that tore from her throat, she raised her pistol and fired a sustained burst into the apparition. The plasma washed over it harmlessly, but the act itself was a defiance. "Do not listen," she screamed at the rest of us, her voice cracking with effort. "It is trying to break our will. It feeds on surrender." All around us, the whispers became a personalized hell. Jax was confronted by the laughing visage of a brother he had failed. Kale by the accusing eyes of a navigational error given human form. The entities offered peace, an end to guilt, a chance to be absolved in the planet's vast, sorrowful memory. They promised we would never be alone again. It was a lie woven from our own deepest vulnerabilities, a psychic poison tailored to each of our souls. We ran, not just from the collapsing cavern, but from the most seductive parts of ourselves, knowing that to hesitate for even a second was to be consumed forever. How do you outrun an enemy that knows the exact shape of the regrets you carry in your heart? We burst from the cavern's maw to a sight that stole our breath. The event horizon was no longer just a ship stranded on an alien world. It was being digested. Thick, black tendrils, like the roots of the planet itself, had crawled up the landing struts and were creeping over the hull, their surfaces shimmering with the same unnatural darkness as the ground. Sections of the outer plating had already lost their metallic sheen, dissolving into the writhing mass. Our sanctuary, our only hope of escape, was being consumed before our eyes. We sprinted, our heavy boots sinking into the yielding ground which now felt like grasping flesh. Inside the airlock, the horror was even more intimate. The ship's internal lights flickered erratically, and the walls were streaked with patches of deep, invasive shadow that seemed to pulse with a slow, hungry rhythm. Jax was already at the main engineering console, his fingers flying across the interface, his face a mask of sweat and desperation. "The systems are rejecting my commands," he yelled, his voice cracking with strain. "It is not a failure, it is an invasion. The planet is in the ship. Its code is overriding our own. Every command I send is being twisted, rerouted into the dark. We are locked out of our own home." As if to prove his point, the ship-wide comms system crackled to life, but instead of static, it emitted a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Stay, be remembered." The voice was a composite of every lost soul the planet had ever claimed, and it spoke directly to the fear coiled in our chests. At the same time, the shadowy patches on the walls began to coalesce, forming the vague, shifting outlines of human figures that reached for us with insubstantial hands. We were under a dual assault, our technology turning against us while the ghosts in the machine played on our deepest desires for peace, for an end to the struggle. Valeria and Kale stood back to back, firing controlled plasma bursts at the forming entities, not to harm them, but to disperse the coalescing darkness, buying Jack's precious seconds. The air grew colder, and the psychic weight of the planet pressed in, offering a seductive promise. It showed us a vision of laying down our weapons, of our bodies dissolving into a painless, eternal unity with the great consciousness below. The temptation was a physical ache, a siren song for the weary. To fight it was to fight the most basic instinct to rest. Jax slammed his fist on the console, a spark of defiant clarity in his eyes. I am rerouting all auxiliary power through the primary data bus. It might fry half the systems, but it could burn this thing out of the core network. On my mark, the ship shuddered around us, a deep, groaning sound of metal being stressed to its absolute limit. The tendrils outside tightened their grip, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. We were not just trying to save a ship. We were trying to reclaim a piece of reality from an entity that sought to absorb it entirely. Could we purge an infection that was woven into the very circuits of our only hope? The ship bucked violently, a dying beast in its final throes. On the bridge, Captain Restova's voice cut through the chaos, her order a blade of cold necessity. All power to the engines now, but the engines were dead, their song silenced by the shadow that gripped us. In that terrible stillness, Engineer Sato's voice came over the calm and horrifyingly final. He was still in engineering, surrounded by the creeping dark. I can manually trigger the overload from here, he said. The core will go critical. It will create a pulse, a shockwave in reality itself. It is the only way to break their hold. You have to go. A chorus of protests erupted, but Sato's tone left no room for argument. This is not a debate. It is a calculation. 1 life for 6. Tell my family I love the stars. His last words were a whisper of static and profound courage. Now go. For a heartbeat, there was only the oppressive silence of the planet and the frantic beating of our own hearts. Then a light bloomed deep within the event horizon's heart. It was not the clean, white light of a star, but a furious, brilliant flash of raw energy that erupted from the ship and washed over the planet's surface. The effect was immediate and cataclysmic. The psychic scream in our minds became a shriek of pure agony, and the physical pull of the planet's gravity shattered like glass. The ship lurched free, thrown backward by the force of its own self-immolation. We were thrown against our consoles, the G-forces crushing, as what was left of the event horizon was hurled away from the dying world. Behind us, the brilliant flash faded, leaving a scar of fading light on the perfect blackness of the shadow planet. Sato was gone, his life and his memory absorbed into the very entity he had dealt a crippling blow. He had not just given us a chance to escape. He had given the starving god a final, poisoned meal, a burst of energy so violent it forced the abyss to loosen its grip. What is the value of a single, selfless act against an eternity of hunger? In that moment, it was worth everything. The event horizon shuddered, a broken bird escaping a cage of living rock. We hurtled backward into the void, the viewports showing a nightmare in reverse. The shadow planet did not sit passively as we fled. Its surface swirled with violent, chaotic patterns, dark energy crackling across its form like lightning on a thunderhead of pure nothingness. It was not just a world. It was a wounded god, and we had stolen its meal. Captain Restova gripped the mangled remains of her command chair, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the receding sphere of absolute dark. Her voice was low, a gravelly promise carved from loss and terror. "We have to warn everyone," she said, the words hanging in the cold, thin air of the ruined bridge. "This border is not a frontier. It is a quarantine zone." Her declaration reframed our entire existence. We had not been explorers pushing the boundaries of knowledge. We had been mice scurrying along the edge of a cage, and we had just seen the teeth of the thing that lived inside. The galaxy we knew, with its bustling colonies and proud starfleets, was not expanding into an empty wilderness. It was nestled against the walls of a prison containing something infinitely old and ravenously hungry. Every chart, every deep space beacon, every directive from command was a dangerous lie, a map that showed an open plain where there was actually a bottomless pit. Our mission of discovery had been a suicide run from the start. The silence on the bridge was heavier than the void outside. We were carrying a truth that could shatter human civilization, a warning that the dark between the stars was not empty, but occupied, and that the occupants saw us only as sustenance. How do you tell a species that has reached for the stars that it has been building its house on the edge of a graveyard? The silence on the bridge was a fragile thing, broken only by the frantic beeping of our long-range sensor array. I turned to the screen, my blood running cold. The other shadow planets were no longer drifting in aimless orbits. They were moving with a chilling, coordinated precision, a celestial ballet of dark spheres reconfiguring themselves across the void. Their formation was not random. It was a pattern, a net, and we were the fly trying to escape its weave. Science Officer Lynn stared at her console, her face a portrait of dawning, absolute horror. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it filled the entire bridge. "They are not just planets," she said. "They are a network. A single distributed consciousness spread across multiple bodies, and now it is aware of us. It knows there is life beyond its prison." Her words landed with the force of a physical blow. We had not simply angered one entity. We had alerted the entire ecosystem. Each shadow planet was not a separate grave, but a single node in a vast, star-spanning mind, a hive intelligence of immortal, starving souls. Our desperate act of survival had not been an escape. It had been a dinner bell ringing through the entire neighborhood. The implications were more terrifying than anything we had yet faced. A single one of these worlds had nearly consumed us completely. What could a coordinated group of them do? Their collective gravitational influence could reshape star lanes, redirect comets, or simply reach out with a thought and snuff out suns, plunging entire systems into a darkness from which nothing could escape. They were not just a threat to one ship. They were a galactic-scale predator, and humanity had just stumbled, bleeding and screaming, into its hunting grounds. We had brought back a warning, but the warning was far worse than we ever imagined. The quarantine zone was not just a line on a map. It was the only thing standing between our galaxy and a sentient, hungry void that had just learned we were here. A wave of absolute darkness erupted from the nearest shadow planet. It was not a cloud of dust or debris. It was a tide of nothingness, a physical void that moved faster than light, swallowing the starlight in its path as it surged toward us. On the bridge, Helmsman Kale's hands were a blur across his console, his voice rising into a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. "It is catching up. I have never seen anything move like that. The engines are at 120%, and it is not enough." The ship shuddered violently, every joint and seam groaning in protest. Then the wave hit. It did not strike the hull with an impact. It simply settled over us. The main viewport, which a moment before had shown the desperate glow of our engines and the distant stars, was instantly blotted out. An unnatural twilight fell across the bridge, a dim, soupy gloom that seemed to emanate from within the ship itself. Our console lights, once bright and steady, flickered and dimmed to a dull, bloody crimson. The very air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and ancient dust. We were not just being chased, we had been swallowed. The darkness was not outside the ship anymore. It was in here with us, a living presence that pressed against our skin and whispered directly into our minds. It was a silence so deep you could hear the phantom echoes of every fear you had ever harbored. How do you outrun an enemy that is not just behind you, but is already inside the room? The darkness inside the ship was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that absorbed all sound and hope. Every console on the bridge went black simultaneously, the hum of the engines replaced by an impossible, total silence. For 3 heartbeats, we were suspended in a sensory vacuum, blind and deaf. Then, a single, weak emergency light flickered on above the command chair, casting a dim, crimson puddle that only made the surrounding shadows feel more aggressive. Jax was already on his knees, panel open, his face illuminated by the faint glow of a handheld diagnostic tool. His hands moved with a frantic, desperate energy, but his voice was hollow with a terror that went beyond system failure. "This is not an electromagnetic pulse," he whispered, the words sharp in the quiet. "There is no surge, no damage to the circuits. It is something else." He looked up, his eyes wide in the bloody light. "It is unmaking our technology, rewriting the fundamental laws of reality around us. The very principles that allow a circuit to conduct electricity, a fusion core to contain a star, are being edited. Our science is becoming fiction here." As if to prove his point, the emergency light above us began to dim, not like a dying bulb, but as if the concept of lumens itself was being drained from the local universe. The shadows in the corners of the bridge deepened, solidifying into shapes that hinted at solid forms. We were not just losing power. We were losing the rules that made power possible. How do you fight an enemy that does not attack your ship, but instead dismantles the physics that allows your ship to exist? A low, familiar voice spoke from the darkness beside Valeria. It was Sergeant Miller, his face smudged with the dust of a long-dead Martian outpost, his eyes holding the same calm trust they had on the day he died following her order. The air around them shimmered, and the cold bridge of the event horizon melted away, replaced by the cramped, shaking interior of a drop ship. The scent of ozone and blood filled her nostrils. She could feel the heat of the explosion that had torn through the hull, hear the desperate, crackling final words of her team over the comms as the vacuum claimed them. It was all there, every detail of her greatest failure, playing out not as a memory but as a present, agonizing reality. The entity was not just showing her the past. It was making her relive it, drowning her in a guilt so fresh it stole her breath. "You could have saved us, Valeria," Miller whispered, his voice a perfect, heartbreaking echo. His hand reached for hers. "Just let go, the pain ends here." For a moment her resolve wavered, the weight of a decade of grief threatening to crush her. Her fingers trembled, aching to accept the offered peace, to finally lay down the burden. But then she saw a flicker of hungry anticipation in the shadows behind Miller's eyes, a subtle wrongness in the way the scene repeated with such perfect, cruel clarity. This was not absolution, it was consumption. Her jaw tightened. She ripped her hand away, her voice rising from a choked whisper to a raw, defiant shout that cut through the phantom screams of her team. "I know what you are," she roared, her gaze locked on the apparition. "You are a parasite. You feed on regret, but I have made peace with my past. Their deaths are a part of me, not a chain you can use. I carry them with honor." The moment the words left her lips, the illusion shattered. Miller's compassionate face dissolved into a shriek of static and twisting shadows before vanishing completely. The dropship interior collapsed back into the dim, crimson-lit bridge. The vision was gone, but the victory was small and personal. The entity had retreated from her mind, but the oppressive darkness around them remained, already seeking a weaker target. If it could not break us with our past, what fresh nightmares would it conjure from our fears of the future? The darkness recoiled from Valeria's defiance, but it did not retreat. It simply shifted its focus, the pressure in the air condensing around Captain Rostova. She stood rigid at her station, her mind a battleground. The entity showed her a future, a vision of the event horizon drifting forever as a derelict, its halls filled with the whispering, contented ghosts of her crew, all pain finally erased. The temptation to provide that peace, to end the fight, was a seductive poison, but through the psychic static, a single, brilliant thread of awareness snapped into place. The entity was a predator of sorrow, of regret, of individual trauma. It thrived on the isolated, broken pieces of a soul, but it recoiled from Valeria's defiant honor. It could not digest a memory held with love, only one festering with guilt. Her voice cut through the thick air, sharp and clear. It does not understand unity. It feeds on what divides us on our private hells. Do not fight it alone. Focus, all of you, focus on one thing. One memory we all share that is filled with hope. For a moment, there was only confused silence. Then, Science Officer Lin spoke, her voice soft but steady, a tiny point of light in the gloom. The Arcturus Nebula, she began. Remember our first long-range jump? We came out of warp right on its edge. The viewport was filled with this sea of violet and gold, a stellar nursery glowing with the light of unborn suns. We all just stood there on the bridge for almost an hour. No one spoke, we just watched. One by one, we remembered. Cale recalled the specific, awe-inspiring chart he had to plot. Jax remembered the complete, pristine silence of the comms, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Valeria lowered her weapon, a rare, genuine smile touching her lips as she recalled the feeling of absolute peace. A moment where there were no enemies, no threats, only beauty on a scale that made every human worry feel insignificant. We did not just recall the memory individually. We shared it, our minds linking in a fragile network of collective wonder. A soft, golden light began to emanate from us, not from the dead consoles, but from our very bodies. It was faint, like the first hint of dawn, but it was real. And where that light touched, the oppressive darkness recoiled. The solid shadows in the corners of the bridge wavered and pulled back, their forms becoming indistinct. The psychic pressure, that chorus of lost souls, faltered, replaced by a single, harmonious feeling of our shared experience. It was not a powerful blast. It was a candle flame in a vast cavern. But it was a flame the absolute dark could not extinguish. We had found our weapon, and it was the one thing this ancient, starving entity could never comprehend: the selfless, unifying power of a hope we held in common. In a universe that had built a god from hunger and sorrow, our shared memory was a shield it could not break. The shared memory was a fragile shield, a pocket of warmth in an ocean of cold hunger. But it was enough. The darkness churned around us, its formless anger a pressure against our minds. Then, the whispering chorus of lost souls fell silent, replaced by a single, clear voice that spoke not in our ears, but directly into the core of our consciousness. It was the voice of the planetary mind itself, no longer mimicking our dead, but speaking with the weary, ancient weight of eons. We offer you a choice, it intoned, the words resonating with an impossible promise. Cease this futile struggle, lay down your burdens, join us and become eternal. You will not be consumed. You will be preserved, your experiences, your knowledge, your very essence woven into the tapestry of our collective forever. You will know all that we have known, see all that we have seen. You will achieve a form of immortality your species has only dreamed of in myths. It was the most seductive trap imaginable. The entity showed us a vision of this union, a state of being where every question was answered, every pain soothed, every individual life expanded into a boundless, shared existence. It felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. It felt like peace. For a terrifying moment, the temptation was a physical ache, a pull stronger than any gravity. Captain Ristova stood at the center of our shared light, her face a mask of strain as she fought against the offer's perfect logic. Her voice, when it came, was quiet at first, but it grew with each word, forged in the fires of everything we had just survived. We define our own destiny, she said, her gaze fixed on the swirling dark before her. Our lives have meaning not because they last forever, but because they end. Our choices matter because they are made in the face of that end. Our memories are precious because they are ours, and ours alone. You offer us a cage made of starlight and call it heaven. You do not want us to join you, you need us to feed you. We will not become prisoners for your sustenance. With a final, wrenching effort of will, she did not just reject the offer. She severed the connection. It was like slamming a psychic door, a silent, definitive crack that echoed through all of us. The shared vision of immortality shattered into a million glittering shards that were instantly swallowed by the dark. The response was immediate and furious. The gentle, persuasive presence vanished, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated rage. The darkness that surrounded the ship congealed, the formless shadows solidifying into sharp, jagged talons of absolute black that began to scrape against the hull with a sound that was not a sound, but a vibration that threatened to shake our atoms apart. The entity was done negotiating. It had been denied its meal, and now it would simply take what it wanted by force. The final, desperate battle for our souls had truly begun. The scraping talons of darkness became a physical force, a gravity that gripped the ship with the strength of a dying star. The event horizon groaned, its superstructure screaming in protest as it was dragged backward, stern first, toward the churning surface of the shadow planet. We were caught in an invisible net, reeled in by a will that treated physics as a suggestion. Cale fought the helm, his muscles corded with the strain, his face a grimace of pure concentration. "It is not just pulling us," he gasped. "It is rewriting the local gravitational constant. I cannot break free with thrust alone." His eyes darted across the navigational readouts, which showed a terrifyingly complex web of gravity wells and shifting spacetime around the planet. Then he saw it, a single, sliver-thin path through the chaos, a gravitational eddy, a flaw in the entity's own overwhelming power. His voice was a sharp, decisive cut through the panic. "I am turning us into the pull. We are going to use its own strength against it. A gravity slingshot." The order was insane, a suicidal dive toward the very thing trying to consume us. Captain Restova did not hesitate. "Do it." The ship shuddered as Cale killed the forward thrust, and instead fired the port maneuvering thrusters at full power, swinging our nose directly toward the planet. We plummeted, a stone falling into a well, the oppressive black sphere filling the viewport. The G-forces were immense, crushing us into our seats, the sound of the hull a continuous, metallic shriek. Just as it felt the event horizon would be torn apart, Cale fired the main engines at their absolute limit. We skimmed the upper atmosphere of the shadow world, using its monstrous gravitational pull like a whip to crack our speed, hurling us away on a new, desperate vector. The sound of the hull was a sickening series of pops and groans, and a dozen new alarm lights flashed crimson across the bridge. We had gained distance, but at a terrible cost. The ship was bleeding, its bones broken, but we were free of the immediate pull. We had stolen momentum from a god, and the price was written in the stressed metal of our only home. The stolen momentum bled away into the void, leaving us adrift in a silence that felt more threatening than any scream. The frantic red lights on the bridge were the only things moving, their steady pulse a countdown to an end we could not outrun. One by one, our primary systems flickered and died, until only the emergency life support remained, its low hum a fragile thread tethering us to existence. The main viewport was a sheet of blank, starless black, offering no comfort, no landmark, no hope. Engineer Davis, the man who had taken Sato's place, emerged from a maintenance shaft, his face and uniform smeared with hydraulic fluid and soot. He did not need to consult a console. The ship's agonized groans and the thinning, metallic taste of the air told him everything. He stood before the captain, his shoulders slumped not in defeat, but in the grim finality of a completed calculation. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion by the sheer weight of the numbers. "Life support is failing, Captain. The carbon dioxide scrubbers are damaged beyond field repair. The warp core is a tomb, cold and silent. We are dead in the water." He took a slow, deliberate breath, the sound loud in the heavy air. "We have maybe 48 hours of air." After that, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. "We need a miracle." The words settled over the bridge, colder than the vacuum outside. 48 hours. It was not enough time to fix the unfixable. Not enough time to send a distress signal that would take years to reach anyone. Not enough time to do anything but wait for the slow, suffocating embrace of the end. Every breath we took was a tangible reminder of the dwindling resource, a countdown measured in heartbeats. We had escaped a god of darkness only to find ourselves trapped in a metal coffin. Our victory revealed as a brief, cruel postponement of the inevitable. What is the value of a hard-won freedom when the only thing waiting for you is a slow and silent death in the absolute nowhere? The metallic tang of fear was now joined by the scent of ozone and scorched wiring. Jax moved through the wreckage of the communications station, his hands a steady contrast to the tremor in his voice. He bypassed the ship's primary antenna array, a tangled ruin of melted circuitry, and began patching cables directly into a secondary transceiver. His work was a desperate kind of surgery, rerouting power from non-essential systems and weaving a new transmission path from the scraps of what was left. He spoke without looking up, his words meant for the captain but heard by everyone on the bridge. "I can rig a narrow-band transmitter. It will be weak, a whisper compared to our old signal. It will take days, maybe more than a week, to reach the nearest deep space outpost." He finally paused, his fingers hovering over a connection. He met Captain Rostova's gaze, his expression grim. "And we have to broadcast our location. We are essentially shouting into the dark from the edge of a predator's den. There is no guarantee who or what will hear us first. It is a gamble, but it is the only play we have. Let us hope someone is listening." With a final, decisive click, he closed the circuit. A low, thrumming whine filled the air as the makeshift transmitter powered up. On his console, a single, pulsing dot of light began its journey. It was a message in a bottle, hurled into an ocean that we now knew was filled with monsters. We had traded the certainty of a slow death for the terrifying uncertainty of a call for help. A beacon that could bring salvation or summon an even greater darkness to our doorstep. A single, persistent chime cut through the oppressive silence of the bridge. On the long-range sensor display, a ghost of a reading flickered, a tiny blip against the overwhelming void. Science Officer Lin leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she filtered out the background noise of deep space. "It is a planetoid," she announced, her voice a fragile thread of disbelief. "A rogue body drifting on the edge of this system. It's small, barely a moon, but my scans indicate a thin atmosphere. It is not breathable, but it exists." Captain Rostova was at her side in an instant, her gaze locked on the faint signal. It represented more than just a celestial body. It was an anchor, a piece of reality in a sea of nothingness. Her voice, when she gave the order, was stripped of all emotion, a simple, raw statement of survival. "Helm, plot a new course. That is not much, but it is solid ground and might have resources we can use. We have to try." The words hung in the thin air, a testament to a hope so desperate it was almost painful. We were trading the certain, silent death of our ship for the uncertain dangers of an unknown world, a gamble where the stakes were our last few hours of life. What forgotten piece of rock could offer salvation to a crew on the brink of oblivion? The event horizon groaned its way into the thin atmosphere, a sound of pure metal fatigue. We hit the surface not with a controlled touchdown, but with a series of jarring, brutal impacts. The remaining landing gear shrieked and buckled, dropping the ship's port side onto the unforgiving rock with a final, sickening crunch of collapsing struts. For a long moment, we just sat in the sudden silence, listening to the ship's death rattle, the hiss of escaping pressure and the frantic beeping of new, critical damage reports. We were down, but we were far from safe. The airlock doors slid open to reveal a desolate expanse of gray, wind-scoured rock under a sky of unbroken black. There were no stars, no sun, only the faint, reflected glow from the distant galactic rim, casting the landscape in a perpetual, eerie twilight. It was a tombstone of a world barren and silent. Yet, as our boots crunched on the gritty surface, Science Officer Lynn held up her scanner, its screen casting a soft blue light on her face. Her voice was a whisper of pure, defiant hope. "The readings are picking up massive subsurface deposits. Water ice, Captain, locked deep beneath the rock. It is not much, but it is a chance. We can use the ship's emergency recycler to melt it, to create water, even breathable air." The ground beneath our feet was dead, but hidden deep within its frozen heart was the very substance of life itself. We had traded our metal coffin for a rocky one, but this one held a key. Could we mine hope from a world that had never known light? A jagged crater yawned open before us, its rim sharp against the perpetual twilight. Valeria, leading the scouting party, signaled a halt, her silhouette stark against the gray rock. Down in the crater's bowl, something angular and unnatural broke the smooth curve of the landscape. It was a structure, low and domed, half buried in a landslide of ancient debris. Its design was blocky and utilitarian, a style I had only seen in historical archives. This was not alien, this was ours, a pre-Federation outpost, lost and forgotten on this rock at the edge of everything. The air inside was a frozen lungful of time, thick with the dust of decades. Emergency lights, powered by a ghost of a geothermal tap, flickered to life as we breached the airlock, illuminating a control room preserved in a perfect, desolate silence. Consoles sat under a blanket of gray powder. Chairs were tucked neatly under desks, as if the crew had just stepped out for a moment. It was on the central command console that we found it, a data crystal resting in its reader as if waiting for us. Jax managed to bypass the corroded security, and the screen glowed to life, revealing the face of a man from another century, his eyes hollow with a dread we now knew intimately. His logs spoke of a survey mission, of finding strange gravitational anomalies and dark planets that defied their sensors. His voice, cracking with static and fear, detailed their own desperate flight, their own realization that they had stumbled upon something that should have remained sleeping. The final entry was dated 70 years ago. The man stared into the recorder, his face a mask of exhausted terror, and spoke 6 words that sealed our fate. "They are awake, they are coming." The recording ended, leaving us in the silent tomb of the outpost, the weight of his warning pressing down on us. He had known. Someone had known all along, and the knowledge had died here with him. How many other warnings were buried in the dark, and why did no one ever listen? The legacy of the outpost was not just a warning, it was a weapon. While Jax worked to stabilize our failing power grid, I found myself hunched over a dusty console, my fingers tracing the lines of a schematic etched into a crystal display. It was a resonance emitter, a device of terrifyingly elegant design. The previous crew had been building it, a final, desperate act of defiance before the silence took them. My heart hammered against my ribs as the pieces fell into place in my mind. "It does not use brute force," I whispered, my voice trembling with a sudden, fierce hope. "It targets their own psychic frequency, the very energy that binds them together. It is like finding the exact note that can shatter a glass. We can build this." The components were listed with stark clarity. A collection of parts we could salvage from our own dying ship, and the Outpost's stripped-down workshop. It was a mad gamble, an attempt to turn a whisper into a scream that could tear the darkness apart. But after floating in a sea of despair, it was a blueprint for a life raft. Could we assemble a key from the wreckage of 2 lost ships and unlock a prison that had held gods? The blueprint became our Bible, a fragile sheet of light in the cavernous dark of the outpost. There was no grand speech, no moment of debate. Captain Rostova simply looked at each of us, her eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion and resolve on our faces, and gave the only order that made sense. "Scavenge everything." We split into teams, a frantic diaspora moving between the frozen tomb of the outpost and the groaning corpse of our own ship. The air was thick with the sounds of desperation. The screech of metal being torn from its moorings and the crackle of plasma cutters slicing through bulkheads. Jax and I descended into the outpost's lower levels, our breath pluming in the frigid air as we stripped conduit and power relays from walls that had not known a living touch in 70 years. Every component we pulled felt like a relic, a piece of a forgotten prayer. Back on the event horizon, the work was more visceral, more painful. Valeria and Lynn worked in the ruined cargo bay, their faces set in grim masks as they dismantled non-essential systems, harvesting emitter arrays and focusing crystals from our own damaged sensor pallets. It felt like performing surgery on a dying friend, taking its organs to build a weapon. But the true crucible was in engineering. Davis and Kale stood amid a snarl of cables and scorched metal, the unstable heart of our planned emitter. The salvaged outpost power regulator was a museum piece, its output erratic and weak. Kale's hands flew across a diagnostic panel, his voice tight with frustration. The coupling is not compatible. The power surge will fry the entire array the moment we activate it. We need to recalibrate the entire feed. Davis wiped a greasy hand across his brow, his patience, already stretched to its limit, finally snapped. He slammed a heavy wrench down on a console, the bang echoing in the confined space. "We do not have time for perfect," he roared, his voice raw. "Look around you, Kale." Perfect died with Sato. We need functional. We need a spark, not a symphony. His words hung in the ozone-charged air, a brutal truth that silenced further argument. Together, in a frantic, furious ballet, they bypassed safeties, rerouted conduits with raw, uninsulated cable, and jury-rigged a connection between the ancient regulator and our ship's auxiliary capacitors. The result was a shuddering, sparking monstrosity of a power core, humming with a dangerous, unpredictable energy. It was unstable, volatile, and exactly what we needed. A bomb we hoped would be loud enough to shatter the silence of the gods. The jury-rigged emitter hummed with a dangerous, unstable energy, a fragile needle we were hoping to stab into the eye of a god. Then the proximity alert screamed, a single, piercing tone that cut through our frantic work. On the long-range scanner, one of the distant shadow planets was no longer drifting. It had broken from its celestial formation, its trajectory a perfect, unwavering line aimed directly at our tiny, rocky refuge. Captain Rostova stood before the main viewer, her silhouette framed by the impossible black sphere growing steadily larger. Her hands, usually restless, were perfectly still at her sides. Her voice was low, stripped of all fear, leaving only a core of hardened resolve. It is not giving up. It is coming for us, and this time we will be ready. The words were not a boast. They were a vow, forged in the memory of a lost engineer and the ghosts of a forgotten outpost. We had nowhere left to run. This scarred planetoid was our Alamo, and the final battle for our souls was now on a direct collision course with our doorstep. Could a spark of defiance, built from scrap and desperation, hold back a tide of ancient, starved consciousness? The makeshift emitter was a skeletal tower of scavenged parts, its central crystal pulsing with a faint, sickly light. We hauled it to the summit of the highest plateau, a desolate peak that offered a clear line of sight to the approaching doom. The sky above was already changing, the faint starlight from the galactic rim dimming as if a vast, light-absorbing curtain were being drawn across the heavens. Valeria directed the final placement with a sniper's precision, her voice cutting through the thin, cold air. "It has to be perfect," she stated, her eyes never leaving the alignment scope. "A single degree off and we are just shouting at a storm." As the emitter locked into position, she turned to the rest of us, her expression granite. She began placing portable shield generators at the base of the plateau, their hum a fragile counterpoint to the growing silence. "It will try to stop us," she said, her words leaving no room for doubt. "It knows what we are building. We have to protect the emitter at all costs. That is the only objective now. Everything else is secondary." We fanned out, taking up defensive positions behind the jagged rock formations that littered the summit. The air grew colder, and a profound stillness fell, the kind of quiet that exists only in the moment before a detonation. The darkness was not just approaching, it was descending, a physical weight pressing down from above, and at its center, the shadow planet now filled half the sky, a perfect sphere of nothingness that promised our erasure. We were a handful of soldiers aiming a slingshot at a god, and the giant had just taken its first world-ending step. A wave of screaming shadow broke against the plateau. The entities did not fly so much as pour from the dark planet like ink from a shattered well, their forms shifting from one terrifying silhouette to the next. They were nightmares given momentum, a tide of teeth and claws and grasping, insubstantial hands that flowed over the rocks. Valeria's voice was a whip crack over the comms. "Hold the line, fire at will." Plasma bolts carved brilliant, temporary scars through the advancing darkness. Each direct hit caused an entity to shriek, a sound that was not sound but a vibration of pure agony in our minds, and dissolve into a cloud of dissipating smoke. But for every one we vaporized, 3 more took its place, scrambling over the scree with impossible speed. They were learning, adapting their forms to present smaller targets, flowing around our defensive positions. We were a tiny island of light and heat in an ocean of absolute cold, and the ocean was rising. Then Kale, his face lit by the frantic glow of the emitter's control panel, slammed his fist down on the activation sequence. The emitter tower shuddered, its central crystal flaring from a sickly pulse to a sustained, piercing white radiance. A visible wave of pure sonic force, tinged with that same white light, erupted from the tower and washed over the battlefield. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for the shadow host. The advancing entities did not just recoil, they convulsed, their forms losing all cohesion, shredding like black paper in a hurricane. The psychic scream of their pain became a deafening roar inside our skulls, a symphony of confusion and rage. They clawed at their own disintegrating bodies, their attack breaking into chaotic, scattered pockets. The resonance was working. We were not just hurting them. We were unmaking the very energy that held them together, turning their own collective consciousness against them. For the first time, we had drawn blood from the darkness, and the abyss was howling in surprise. The piercing white radiance from the emitter began to falter, its steady hum warping into a high-pitched, agonized whine. A wave of intense heat washed over the plateau, and the skeletal tower began to glow a dull, dangerous red. Sparks erupted from its jury-rigged couplings, and the central crystal flickered erratically, threatening to plunge us back into darkness. The emitter was dying, and its death throes would tear this entire rock apart. Jax did not hesitate. He shoved past Kale, his eyes locked on the shuddering control panel, his hands already moving to manual overrides. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the mechanical scream of the failing machine. "Get to the ship," he said, his gaze never leaving the readouts. "I will hold it as long as I can." Do not let this be for nothing. There was no time for argument, no moment for farewells. The ground beneath our feet trembled, not from the shadow entities, but from the unstable reactor core we had built, now overloading at the heart of our only weapon. We turned and ran, the heat of the emitter burning our backs, each step carrying us away from the friend who had just chosen to become a permanent part of the silence. What is the final act of a man who knows he is already a ghost? And what legacy does he leave in the echo of his sacrifice? The control panel erupted in a shower of white-hot sparks, searing the air with the smell of vaporized metal. Jax did not flinch. With a final, desperate roar that tore from the depths of his soul, he slammed both hands onto the manual override, forcing every last joule of power from the dying capacitors into the emitter core. The piercing whine of the machine climbed into a singular, shattering scream of pure energy, and then the entire plateau vanished in a wave of silent, blinding white. The resonance cascade did not travel. It simply was everywhere at once, a hammer of perfect frequency striking the heart of the impossible. The wave of disruptive energy hit the shadow planet not as an attack, but as a cancellation. The colossal sphere of absolute dark did not just shudder. It convulsed, its seamless surface rippling like disturbed water. For the first time, light was not consumed. It was born from within. Jagged fissures of brilliant, furious violet and gold tore across the planet's form, bleeding the trapped light of 1,000 consumed suns back into the void. The psychic scream that had haunted us for so long became a chorus of 1,000,000,000 shattered connections, a network of immortal minds suddenly, violently severed. The entity's hold on the local space shattered like glass. The oppressive gravity that had pinned us to this rock simply vanished. The shadow planet, wounded and reeling, began to move. It was not a strategic retreat. It was a flight, a panicked withdrawal back into the deeper void from which it had come, its form still cracking with the painful, beautiful light of its own unraveling. We had not destroyed a god. We had given it a scar, a permanent reminder that even the most ancient hunger can be made to feel pain. And in the echoing silence it left behind, we were left with a single, terrifying question. What happens when a predator this old and this vast goes home to lick its wounds? And what will it become when it decides to hunt again? The brilliant white flash faded, leaving a ghost of itself burned onto our retinas. Where the plateau had been, there was now only a churning cloud of incandescent gas and molten rock, the entire landmass reshaped by the emitter's self-annihilation. The event horizon hung in the silence, a spectator to a funeral pyre we had built with our own hands. On the bridge, no one spoke. The only sound was the ragged rhythm of our own breathing, a stark reminder of the life that had just been extinguished to preserve our own. Captain Rostova stood at her station, her gaze fixed on the devastation below. Her voice, when it finally came, was a low, hollowed-out thing, stripped of all grandeur. His sacrifice saved us all. We will remember. The words were not a eulogy for the man alone, but a vow for all of them, for Sato, for the ghosts of the Outpost, for every soul this hungry dark had ever claimed. It was a promise carved from grief, a tiny flicker of meaning salvaged from the void. Then her posture straightened, the weight of command settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar, heavy cloak. She turned to Kale at the helm, her expression a mask of grim resolve. Set a course for home. The order was simple, but it echoed with a finality that chilled the air. Home was no longer a place of safety and familiar stars. It was a mission, a vector pointing toward a civilization blissfully unaware of the ancient, wounded predator we had just angered. We were not returning as heroes. We were returning as the sole survivors of a shipwreck, carrying a warning from the edge of the abyss. What do you say to a species dreaming of the stars when you are the only one who knows what truly lives in the dark between them? The journey home stretched into a silent, star-dusted eternity. The event horizon limped through the void, its warp drive a cold, silent tomb, its hull a mosaic of scars and makeshift patches that groaned with every minor course correction. We were a ghost ship, carrying ghosts, the vibrant crew that had set out now replaced by hollowed-out survivors who jumped at the sound of a conduit hissing or a distant alarm beep. Sleep brought no rest, only the same recurring dream of a perfect, lightless sphere and the whispering promises of an end to pain. We would wake in a cold sweat, the taste of ozone and dust still clinging to the back of our throats, the memory of Jack's final, determined roar echoing in the silence. The darkness we had escaped was no longer outside the ship. It had taken root inside us, a psychic residue that colored every thought, every glance out at the peaceful, unsuspecting stars. In the quiet hours between shifts, Science Officer Lin became a woman possessed. She sequestered herself in the damaged astrometrics lab, surrounded by the flickering ghosts of data streams, compiling every sensor reading, every personal log. every fragmented memory into a single, damning document. Her final entry was not a scientific conclusion, but a warning carved from the bones of our dead. She wrote, her words stark and uncompromising on the screen. The shadow planets are a galactic-scale threat. They are prisons for a dying, transcendent race that will consume any consciousness they can reach. This border must be sealed. That final sentence hung in the air, a verdict that condemned entire sectors of space to eternal quarantine. It was a plea for survival that demanded the sacrifice of the dream of exploration, an admission that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. How do you convince a civilization built on curiosity to stop looking, to turn its back on the greatest mystery of all, when you are the only one who has seen the monster waiting in the dark? The return to Federation space was a slow, silent drift into a world we no longer recognized. A patrol ship finally intercepted our ghostly vessel, its clean, bright hull a stark contrast to our scarred and pitted shell. They towed us to a gleaming starbase, a jewel of light and order that felt alien and fragile after the absolute dark. The debriefing chamber was sterile and cold, all polished metal and harsh illumination. Across the wide table, a panel of stern-faced admirals listened, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and deep concern as Captain Ristova laid out our evidence. She presented Lynn's damning data, the logs from the forgotten outpost, the sensor readings of the shadow planet's coordinated flight. Her voice never rose, but each word carried the weight of a star. She concluded not with a plea, but with a final, unshakable declaration. This is not a discovery, it is a warning. We ventured beyond the known galaxy and found a predator. We must not go back. The silence that followed was heavier than the void. One admiral leaned forward, his voice carefully measured. You are asking us to abandon centuries of expansion, to cede entire sectors of space based on the testimony of one traumatized crew. Ristova did not flinch. I am not asking you to believe a story, I am showing you an autopsy report. That corpse is still moving and it is hungry. We are not explorers anymore. We are the canary in the coal mine, and we have just stopped singing. How do you convince a civilization built on hope that the greatest act of courage is now to be afraid? The Federation did not give us a medal. They gave us a new posting and a new ship, the Vanguard, a deep space sentinel built for long-range monitoring and little else. Our mission of discovery was officially over, replaced by a permanent, silent vigil. We were no longer explorers. We were wardens, tasked with guarding the door to a cage we had helped lock. Valeria stood beside me on the new bridge, her gaze fixed on the star chart that now displayed a vast, red-shaded exclusion zone. Someone has to stand watch, she said, her voice as steady and unyielding as the hull of our new vessel. If we do not, others will follow that signal, and they might not be as lucky as we were. Her words were not spoken with pride, but with the grim weight of a soldier accepting a duty no one else could understand. Our new mission was a paradox, a life dedicated to ensuring no one else ever experienced the wonders or the horrors we had found. We were to become a myth, a ghost story whispered among starfarers, a warning to stay away from the dark. How do you live a life defined by the thing you are trying to forget, when your only purpose is to remember it forever? The silence on the Vanguard was a fragile thing, perpetually on the verge of shattering. We had grown accustomed to the quiet hum of our monitoring systems, the only sound in our self-imposed exile at the edge of everything. Then, a single, anomalous chime broke the calm. On the long-range communications panel, a light began to pulse, a faint, rhythmic flicker in the void. Science Officer Lynn was on it in an instant, her hands moving with a practiced, weary efficiency. Her face, usually a mask of detached focus, slowly drained of color. "Captain," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I am picking up a signal. Its origin point is deep inside the quarantine zone." The signal was weak, a ghost of a whisper, but its structure was horrifyingly familiar. It was a distorted echo of the Event Horizon's own final distress call, the very message Jax had sent out before his sacrifice. But the cry for help had been warped, the data stream corrupted into a mocking, recursive loop. The coordinates were our own, bounced back from the heart of the darkness we had fled. It was not a call for aid. It was a perfect, chilling mimicry. Captain Rostova stood from her command chair, her gaze fixed on the screen, on the impossible signal emanating from a place that should have been utterly silent. She looked from the data stream to the faces of her crew, to the ghosts of memory reflected in our eyes. Her expression was not one of surprise, but of a grim, resigned horror. "It is learning," she said, her voice low and steady, a statement of fact that froze the air in the room, "and it is not done with us yet." The words hung in the sterile air of the bridge, a final, terrible confirmation. Our vigil was not a prevention. It was merely the intermission, and the ancient, hungry intelligence we had wounded was now speaking back to us in our own voice, proving that some borders are not just lines on a map, but invitations.